How do I read the book of Galatians? Paul's letter to the Galatians tends to divide people into two camps, those who think highly of it and those who do not. Martin Luther said it was the best book in the Bible. He said, "This is my epistle. I am married to it." However, some people dislike Galatians intensely. They can find it too emotional, and to be fair, it is a very highly charged letter. Some people argue that Galatians is too personal. Certainly Paul does not hold back. He even mentions a public argument that he had with the Apostle Peter. It's also very intellectual. Paul is using all of his rabbinical background and training to argue the case he's making, and it's a tight intellectual argument. This should not put us off the book, but should encourage us to study it. It is also a difficult read. If you have any pride, then don't read Galatians, because you'll have none left by the time you are finished. It skewers religion, strips it away. Legalistic Christians have a harder time with the challenge in Galatians. Who wrote this book? This book is written by Paul, although it would have been dictated to a scribe. It's only at the end, where he wanted to make a last warning, that he writes in his own hand. It's worth remembering, Paul was a Pharisee of the highest order. When reading this letter, remember, he knew the law inside and out. This letter is deeply theological and written by an expert. Who is it written to? It is written to the church in Galatia. Now, there are two places called Galatia. In what we now call Turkey, there was a group of cities in the north called North Galatia, and there was a group of cities in the south called South Galatia. From the 4th to the 19th centuries, the dominant view was that it was to North Galatia. The more recent and more likely view is that it was to the cities in South Galatia, Lystra, Derbe, Antioch and Iconium. This information helps us to understand the date and context of this letter. When was it written? Well, if it was North Galatia, then Paul didn't plant here until after Acts 16, revisiting them in Act 18, which would date the letter at 57 to 58 AD. However, the more likely South Galatia means he visited in his first missionary journey in Acts 13 and 14 and wrote to them shortly after. That would mean it was written between 53 and 54 AD, perhaps as early as 49 AD. This places it before the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, where the church would officially discuss the issues raised in this letter, and this letter may therefore have been a contributing factor in the calling of the Council of Jerusalem. This would make it probably Paul's earliest biblical letter. Before we go into details, how could we describe this book in one sentence? We cannot add the Jewish law to the cross, because the cross plus anything equals nothing. Why did he write it, and how can we understand this book? A report comes to Paul, and he is aghast at how they have gone very quickly astray. In his opening, he expresses his disappointment. They were turning to another gospel, one he describes as no gospel at all, and it appears to have happened very quickly after he left. They were giving up the freedom they had in Jesus, and they were allowing people to compel them to keep to the Jewish laws and the rules of the Old Testament. This happens so easily, and even today we still do it. Paul argued strongly that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, for the just shall live by faith. This letter becomes therefore a thorough explanation of the gospel and what it means for us. It's important to remember all letters take place in a context. They are like hearing one side of a phone call, and to understand the letter, we need to know how this situation arose. After Paul left Galatia, other men took over the work. A group of Jewish believers would often arrive in a new place when Paul had left. And they'd say to the Gentiles, "Don't listen to Paul. He has only given you half the story. He has brought you to faith, but it didn't bring you fully into the faith, because you need the law of Moses as well as Christ." These people were adding to the gospel in a way many modern cults do. But they were adding from Old Testament law, which is still an addition to the gospel. So what was the big deal? On a first reading of the letter, you would think it's about circumcision, for this seems to be the thing Paul is focusing on. And the question arises, why get so concerned about this little thing? But circumcision was the tip of the iceberg, and compelling Gentile converts to do it was part of a legalistic mindset that needed to be tackled. Paul's reaction to this is very strong. I just wish that those who would cut off your foreskins would go the whole hog and castrate themselves. Why is he so against circumcision? The answer is that behind circumcision lay a religion of works, of saving oneself by keeping the commandments. It opened the door. It is an impossible task, but so many people try it. It's because it's impossible that Jesus came and died. So trying to achieve it through the law is to minimize the cross. So Paul is saying, if you go the way of circumcision for the reason these teachers are giving, then all the other 613 laws of the Old Testament will follow. The problem is not circumcision itself, but the way in which it opens the door to the law. If we tell people to keep the law of Moses, we are consigning them to hell because they cannot do it. The real issue was salvation itself. No wonder Paul is so worked up. We can break this letter down with 3 key words: liberty, legalism, license. Chapters 1 and 2 focus on liberty, chapters 3 and 4 on legalism, and chapters 5 and 6 are focused on license. Paul's argument is that neither legalism or license are the true gospel, only the liberty we have through the cross. Liberty, if you will, is the place that stands above both legalism and license, both of which leads to God's wrath. Paul starts by looking at liberty to set up what the other ways of living are not. He begins by giving his background. He was once a persecutor and became a missionary that God called him. He then describes the argument he had with Peter, how Peter was eating with the Gentiles, but when certain men arrived, drew back from doing so because he was afraid of the circumcision group, the very people who were now corrupting the Galatian church. So he tells Peter straight, we are justified by faith in Jesus, not the law, and therefore we must die to the law. We are in a place of liberty. He then moves on to legalism, saying we must choose between grace or the law. We cannot have both. He calls them foolish for believing this. He says, who bewitched you? How is it possible, he asks, to start in the spirit and then complete in the flesh? The cross is a complete work. This book shows what foolishness living by the law is, which may be why the religious don't like it. Paul wraps this up at the start of chapter 5 with some extremely harsh language about those who are in favour of circumcision, but we've already covered that. He then shifts to the other end of the scale, those who preach license. One way of sliding from liberty is legalism. The other is license. We are called to be free, said Paul, but that freedom is not the freedom to indulge the flesh. He says the works of the flesh are obvious. sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. By the way, by ending with "and things like these" means this is not an exhaustive list, but the obvious things. The freedom we have is not so we can engage with these things. It's freedom from sin, not freedom to sin. And Paul is clear, having these things in your life, you are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. He contrasts this to the fruit of the Spirit, saying we are set free so we can walk in this way of living: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against these things, Paul says, there is no law. That is a life that finds the balance. That is a life of liberty, walking in these things. Paul is fighting on two fronts: to keep liberty and to avoid both legalism and license. This book tells us that the Christian life is neither one of legalism or license, but to walk in the liberty we have through the cross. Our lives should be a walk in the Spirit, not in the flesh. We are not controlled by Old Testament laws, and it's a dangerous slope to start applying them. Neither should we give in to the sins of the flesh. We are saved by grace through the cross. Jesus plus anything equals nothing. And we need to remember that on both our worst days and our best.